Thank you so much for watching. If you find value in this video, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. There is a silent epidemic sweeping through the modern world, and it is entirely composed of exhausted women. You have been sold a narrative that your absolute self-reliance is your greatest asset in life and in love. You have been told that building your own empire, never needing anyone, and projecting an aura of impenetrable strength will somehow attract a man who wants to take care of you. Yet you are waking up bone-tired, deeply craving a dynamic where you can finally exhale, drop the armor, and be provided for. You want to be cherished, protected, and relieved of the endless burden of survival. But the very tools you use to build your independent life are actively repelling the provider dynamic you desire. This foundational shift requires a total dismantling of everything modern culture has taught you about relationships. To attract and keep a man who naturally assumes the role of a provider, you must undergo a profound physiological and spiritual transformation. You cannot demand provision from a place of masculine independence. You must cultivate the prerequisite mindset of biblical receptivity. This is not about losing your intelligence or your capability. It is about strategically shifting your energy to create a space where masculine energy is actually required. To understand this transition, we must look at the core metaphor of our first principle, the fortress versus the garden. A hyper-independent woman operates like a fortress. She has built massive, impenetrable walls of self-sufficiency, surrounded by a moat of defensive attitudes and guarded by the constant vigilance of her own capability. She pays her own bills, fixes her own problems, and projects a fierce energy that broadcasts to the world that she needs absolutely no one. While a fortress is incredibly safe, it is also incredibly isolating. When a masculine, provider-oriented man encounters a fortress, his biology and psychology process it in one of two ways. He either sees it as a rival stronghold to be competed with, or he sees it as a self-sustaining structure that simply does not require his protection. A man who is wired to provide wants to be useful. He wants to know that his strength, his resources, and his presence are fundamentally necessary to your well-being. He will not waste his resources reinforcing a fortress that is already perfectly capable of defending itself. The alternative to the fortress is the garden. A garden is lush, inviting, and deeply feminine, but it is also inherently vulnerable. A garden requires cultivation, protection, and a gardener to tend to its borders. When you tear down the stone walls of your hyperindependence and cultivate the soft, receptive soil of a garden, you create an environment that practically begs for a protector. You signal to a masculine man that there is something beautiful and precious here that needs to be sheltered from the harshness of the outside world. Transitioning from the fortress to the garden is not a sign of weakness. It is the ultimate strategy of feminine wisdom. It requires you to consciously stop trying to be the architect, the guard, and the king of your own castle. You must become the beautiful, flourishing space that a king desperately wants to build his castle around. This shift from defensive isolation to inviting receptivity is the absolute bedrock of inspiring a man to take care of you. We see the ultimate blueprint for this exact transition in the biblical narrative of Ruth. When we first meet Ruth, she is the ancient equivalent of the ultimate hyper-independent survivor. She is a destitute widow living in a foreign land, entirely reliant on her own grueling labor just to keep herself and her mother-in-law, Naomi, from starving. Ruth is trapped in a state of endless scavenging, gleaning the leftover barley in the scorching sun. She is exhausted, covered in the dust of the fields, and operating in pure survival mode. Many modern women are living exactly like Ruth in the early chapters of her story. You may not be picking up scraps of barley, but you are scavenging. You are scavenging for corporate validation, hustling for your next paycheck, and grinding through your daily life with the sheer, brute force of your own willpower. You are covered in the invisible dust of stress, burnout, and chronic fatigue. As long as Ruth remained a scavenger in the dirt, she was safe from starvation, but she was entirely alone in her struggle. Boaz, the wealthy and powerful landowner, noticed her hard work, but he did not step in to rescue her while she was actively grinding in the fields. The profound pivot in Ruth's story occurs when she listens to the wisdom of Naomi, who instructs her to fundamentally change her approach. Naomi tells Ruth to wash herself, anoint herself with oils, change her garments, and go down to the thrashing floor where Bose is resting. This is a massive spiritual and physical shift. Ruth has to literally wash off the dirt of her hyperindependence. She has to strip away the identity of the exhausted laborer and adorn herself in the soft, fragrant identity of a receptive woman. She has to stop working and start positioning. When Ruth approaches Bose at the thrashing floor, she does not demand that he pay her bills or solve her problems. She does not hand him a resume of how hard she has worked in his fields to prove she is worthy of his investment. Instead, she uncovers his feet, lies down, and places herself in a posture of ultimate vulnerability. When he wakes, she simply asks him to spread his garment over her, a cultural idiom for asking for his protection, redemption, and provision. She invites him to be the provider. Bose's reaction is immediate and definitive. He does not tell her to go back to the fields and keep hustling. He does not ask her to split the costs of their future life 50-50. Confronted with a woman who has bravely dropped her armor and clearly signaled her need for his masculine covering, his innate protective instincts are entirely activated. He immediately takes over, handling all the legal, financial, and logistical burdens to secure her as his wife. Ruth went from a starving scavenger to a protected, cherished wife solely because she was willing to dismantle her fortress and position herself in the garden of receptivity. To understand why this ancient strategy is so profoundly effective, we must look at the modern psychology of the nervous system. Let us examine the clinical case study of a woman we will call Sarah. Sarah is a classic Type A, highly successful, aggressively autonomous woman. She manages a large team at work, owns her own home, and takes immense pride in the fact that she never has to ask a man for a single dime. Yet, Sarah is deeply unhappy in her romantic life and chronically exhausted in her physical body. She desperately wants a man to take the lead, but every man she dates eventually becomes passive, lazy, or simply walks away. What Sarah does not realize is that her hyperindependence has completely hijacked her biology. She is suffering from severe somatic burnout and a heavily dysregulated nervous system. Because she has spent years acting as her own sole protector and provider, her body is permanently locked in a state of sympathetic arousal. This is the fight or flight mode of the autonomic nervous system. Her brain is constantly scanning for threats, managing crises, and bracing for impact. This chronic sympathetic state physically manifests in Sarah's body. Her jaw is tight, her breathing is shallow and chest-centered, her shoulders are raised toward her ears, and her blood is constantly flooded with cortisol and adrenaline. She suffers from insomnia, digestive issues, and a pervasive sense of anxiety that she tries to mask with more productivity. When Sarah goes on a date, she believes she is presenting herself as a high-value, competent catch. However, her nervous system is broadcasting an entirely different message to the man sitting across from her. This brings us to the psychological framework of polyvagal theory, developed by Dr. Stephen Porges. Polyvagal theory explains how our nervous systems subconsciously communicate with one another through a process called neurosption. Neurosption is the automatic biological scanning we do to determine if another person is safe or dangerous. It happens beneath conscious thought, interpreting microexpressions, vocal tone, muscle tension, and breathing rates. When Sarah sits across from a man, her nervous system is screaming fight or flight. Her voice has a sharp, tight edge. Her gaze is intense and assessing. Her posture is rigid. Through neurosption, the man's nervous system picks up on this sympathetic arousal immediately. Biologically, tension signals danger. The man's brain interprets Sarah's rigid independence not as attractive confidence, but as a competitive threat or a warning that there is a crisis in the environment. Because Sarah is broadcasting the energy of a fellow warrior braced for battle, the man's biology responds accordingly. He either mirrors her tension and becomes combative and argumentative, engaging his own competitive drive, or he checks out entirely. His nervous system concludes that she is already handling the threat, so he can power down and be passive. What he absolutely does not feel is the urge to protect her. You cannot trigger a man's provider instincts when your biology is telling him that you are a fellow soldier in the trenches. To succeed in a relationship where you are taken care of, you must learn to consciously shift your nervous system out of the sympathetic, fight or flight state and into the parasympathetic, rest and digest state. The parasympathetic nervous system is governed by the ventral vagal complex, which is responsible for social engagement, safety, and connection. This is the biological equivalent of washing off the dust of the fields and stepping into the garden. It is the physiological manifestation of feminine softness. When a woman does the deep internal work to regulate her nervous system, everything about her physical presence changes. Her breathing drops from her chest down into her belly, becoming slow and rhythmic. The muscles in her face and jaw relax. Her vocal cords loosen, giving her voice a melodic, soothing quality. Her eyes soften, and her posture becomes fluid and open. She is no longer bracing for impact. She is resting in her own body. When a man encounters a woman in a deeply regulated, parasympathetic state, the neurosptive exchange is profoundly different. His nervous system scans her and immediately registers the biological markers of safety, peace, and vulnerability. Because she is not projecting the aggressive energy of a competitor, his own defensive walls drop. More importantly, her visible softness creates a stark contrast to his masculine hardness. This biological contrast is the exact trigger for male protective instincts. When a man feels the soothing, calm energy of a parasympathetic woman, it bypasses his ego and speaks directly to his evolutionary wiring. He instinctively recognizes that this soft, relaxed creature is not built for the harsh, competitive warfare of the outside world. His brain releases entirely different neurochemicals. Instead of cortisol and adrenaline, he experiences a surge of protective testosterone and bonding hormones. He looks at a woman who is fully relaxed in her feminine energy and feels a sudden, overwhelming urge to step between her and the chaos of the world. He wants to maintain her peace. He wants to secure her environment so that she never has to return to a state of fight or flight. By simply regulating your own nervous system and allowing yourself to biologically rest, you signal to a man that there is a vacancy for a protector. You are showing him, without saying a word, that you are a garden worth building a wall around. This shift from hyperindependence to biblical receptivity is not a one-time event. It is a daily practice of surrender. It means catching yourself when you start to armor up over a minor inconvenience. It means taking a deep breath and physically dropping your shoulders before your partner walks through the door. It means actively choosing to trust that you do not have to micromanage the universe to survive. You have to mourn the illusion of control that your fortress gave you, and embrace the beautiful vulnerability of needing someone else. The modern woman's refusal to be receptive is the greatest barrier to the provision she seeks. You cannot grip the steering wheel with white knuckles and simultaneously complain that no one is driving the car for you. You must let go. You must allow the nervous system to settle, the armor to fall, and the dust of the daily grind to be washed away. When you finally allow yourself to be soft, you will be shocked at how quickly a masculine man will harden his resolve to take care of you. This foundational shift sets the stage for everything that follows. Once you have dismantled the fortress and regulated your internal biology, you become a blank canvas for masculine devotion. The transition from the exhausted scavenger to the cherished partner begins entirely within your own body and spirit. By embracing this deep, physiological surrender, you prepare the soil for a relationship where you are not just surviving, but truly flourishing under the care of a dedicated provider. The first actionable method in this transformation requires mastering the profound power of emotional safety and feminine softness as your primary tool of relational influence. To understand how a feminine woman shapes her relationship, we must embrace the core metaphor of the thermostat versus the weather. The weather is entirely reactive, chaotic, and driven by external pressure fronts. When a storm rolls in, it indiscriminately wrecks everything in its path, entirely out of control and subject to the whims of the atmosphere. A woman who operates like the weather allows every external stressor, every minor disappointment, and every fleeting insecurity to dictate her emotional state. She blows hot and cold, raining down frustration on her partner and creating an environment characterized by unpredictable turbulence. A masculine man cannot relax in a hurricane. If he is constantly bracing for the next emotional thunderstorm, he will remain in a defensive posture, entirely unable to step into the role of a generous, relaxed provider. The thermostat, by contrast, is deliberate, steady, and operates from an internal locus of control. A thermostat does not react to the room, it dictates the room. When the outside world is freezing, the thermostat quietly and consistently radiates warmth until the entire environment aligns with its setting. A deeply feminine woman acts as the emotional thermostat of her relationship. She regulates the emotional climate, maintaining a baseline of softness, grace, and stability, regardless of the chaos happening outside the front door. Male psychology equates a woman's emotional softness directly with the concept of a sanctuary. The modern world is a battlefield for a masculine man, defined by hypercompetition, relentless logic, and the constant pressure to perform and conquer. When he returns from this daily warfare, the absolute last thing he wants to encounter is another battleground inside his own relationship. He is desperately seeking an oasis. A man will readily and joyfully exhaust his financial, physical, and mental resources to provide for a woman who offers him a strictly drama-free, emotionally secure landing pad. This is the highest currency you can offer a provider. When he knows that his presence will be met with emotional stability rather than a barrage of erratic demands, his nervous system associates you with profound relief. You become the reward for his labor, the peaceful harbor that makes his struggles in the outside world entirely worthwhile. We see the absolute mastery of this principle in the biblical narrative of Esther. Esther was an orphaned Jewish girl who found herself married to King Ahasuerus, the most powerful and volatile monarch of the ancient world. When a decree was issued to annihilate her people, Esther was faced with a life-or-death crisis of unimaginable proportions. If there was ever a moment to act like the weather, to panic, to scream, to make frantic demands of her husband, this was it. Yet, Esther understood the profound power of emotional regulation and feminine strategy. She did not storm into the throne room in a state of chaotic distress to nag or force the king into compliance. Instead, she spent 3 days fasting, centering herself, and regulating her own spirit before she even approached him. When she finally stepped into his presence, she did so with profound emotional intelligence, radiating patience and gentle grace. Esther utilized the thermostat method brilliantly. Even when the king offered her up to half his kingdom right then and there, she did not immediately dump her heavy, emotionally charged request onto him. Instead, she invited him to a banquet. She consciously cultivated an environment of pleasure, relaxation, and emotional safety. She allowed him to eat, drink, and experience her soft, non-demanding presence. Incredibly, she waited yet again, inviting him to a second banquet the following day. Esther was deliberately setting the emotional temperature of the room. She was ensuring that the king felt entirely respected, safe, and deeply cherished before she introduced a massive stressor into his reality. By the time she finally made her petition, the king was so disarmed by her grace and so deeply invested in her emotional sanctuary that he moved heaven and earth to grant her request and protect her people. Esther's story is the ultimate masterclass in feminine influence. She did not use forceful demands, masculine aggression, or emotional manipulation to control the most powerful man in her world. She used the irresistible leverage of profound emotional safety. She created an environment so uniquely peaceful and respectful that the king naturally wanted to use his immense power to serve her needs. Modern women often struggle deeply with this concept, a struggle perfectly explained by the modern psychological framework of attachment theory. Attachment theory dictates how we perceive safety and danger in our closest relationships, generally categorized into secure, anxious, and avoidant attachment styles. Many women today operate from an insecure attachment style, specifically an anxious avoidant loop, which directly drives them to act like unpredictable weather rather than a steady thermostat. Let us examine the clinical case study of a woman we will call Emily. Emily desperately wanted a traditional relationship where she felt cherished and financially protected by a strong, capable man. However, Emily suffered from anxious attachment, meaning she possessed a deep, underlying fear of abandonment and a constant need for external validation. Because she did not know how to self-soothe or regulate her own emotions, she relied entirely on her partner to manage her internal climate. Whenever Emily felt slightly insecure or sensed a shift in her partner's mood, she engaged in what psychologists call protest behavior. Protest behavior is the manifestation of the emotional weather. Emily would pick fights over minor issues, send passive-aggressive text messages, or employ the silent treatment. She actively created drama to force her partner to react, subconsciously believing that if he fought for her, it proved he cared. Emily was constantly testing her partner. She would manufacture crises to see if he would drop everything to rescue her, using his reaction as a barometer for his commitment. She equated emotional volatility with passion. What Emily failed to understand was how these anxious avoidant testing behaviors were actively destroying her partner's capacity to be a provider. From her partner's perspective, Emily was not a sanctuary. She was a liability. Every time he tried to relax, he was hit with a new emotional storm. His nervous system remained in a state of chronic vigilance, constantly walking on eggshells to avoid triggering her next outburst. Because he never felt emotionally safe with her, his masculine instinct to provide and protect completely shut down. A man cannot protect a woman from a storm when she is the one generating the lightning. Emily's partner began to withdraw, pulling away his time, his attention, and his resources. He stopped planning dates, stopped offering financial help, and became emotionally distant. Emily interpreted this withdrawal as proof that he didn't care, which only escalated her anxious, stormy behavior, creating a toxic, self-fulfilling prophecy that nearly ended the relationship. The turning point for Emily occurred when she recognized that her protest behaviors were actively repelling the exact dynamic she craved. She had to learn how to transition from anxious avoidant testing behaviors to secure, receptive signaling. This required immense psychological discipline. Emily had to learn how to become the thermostat. When Emily felt a wave of anxiety, instead of immediately projecting that storm onto her partner, she learned to pause. She practiced self-regulation techniques to calm her own nervous system before she spoke. She realized that it was her responsibility to manage her own emotional baseline. This did not mean she suppressed her feelings or accepted poor treatment. It meant she changed the delivery method of her communication. Instead of attacking him with accusations when she felt disconnected, Emily learned to use secure signaling. She would approach him softly and say, "I am feeling a little disconnected today, and I would love to spend some quality time with you tonight." She replaced criticism with clear, vulnerable invitations. She completely eliminated the silent treatment, the passive-aggressive sighs, and the manufactured drama. The transformation in her partner was nothing short of miraculous. As Emily's emotional weather cleared, her partner felt the atmospheric pressure drop. He realized he no longer had to brace for impact when he walked through the front door. For the first time, he experienced Emily as a genuinely safe, peaceful landing pad. The energy he used to spend defending himself against her emotional storms was suddenly freed up. Because he felt emotionally secure, his natural masculine drive to provide surged to the forefront. He began anticipating her needs without being asked. He took over the burden of paying for their shared expenses because he wanted to make her life easier. He started planning elaborate dates to reward her peaceful presence. Emily finally got the provider dynamic she had always wanted, not by demanding it, but by cultivating an environment of absolute emotional safety. This is the hidden secret of male psychology that modern culture actively obscures. A man's willingness to part with his hard-earned resources, his time, and his labor is directly proportional to the amount of peace a woman brings to his life. If you are a source of constant friction, anxiety, and conflict, he will hoard his resources and view you as an adversary. If you are a wellspring of softness, grace, and emotional stability, he will view you as his most precious asset. Cultivating this feminine softness is an active, daily choice. It means resisting the modern urge to be sharp, sarcastic, and combative. It means recognizing that true power in a relationship does not come from out-arguing a man or proving that you are right. It comes from the profound, quiet confidence of knowing that your gentle grace is far more influential than any shouting match could ever be. When you embody the archetype of Esther, you stop trying to force outcomes through sheer willpower. You learn the strategic value of patience. You understand that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply wait, regulate your environment, and create a space so warm and inviting that a man naturally wants to step into it and offer you his protection. This requires a deep level of emotional maturity. You must take full ownership of your internal climate. You cannot expect a man to act like a king if you are constantly acting like a chaotic, undisciplined child throwing tantrums to get your way. You must elevate your emotional intelligence to match the level of the provision you are seeking. Think of emotional safety as the fertile soil required to grow a provider. You cannot plant the seeds of a traditional, taken care of dynamic in soil that is toxic with resentment, jealousy, and chronic dissatisfaction. You must clear the weeds of your insecure attachment. You must water the soil with consistent kindness, predictability, and genuine warmth. When a man looks at a woman who has mastered this, he sees something incredibly rare in the modern dating market. He sees a woman who does not need to tear him down to feel powerful. He sees a woman who is so secure in her feminine essence that she can afford to be soft. This softness is intoxicating to a masculine man. It triggers a deep, ancestral memory of what a home is supposed to feel like. Your emotional regulation is the ultimate gift you can give a provider. It tells him that his efforts are working. When he sees that his presence brings you peace, and that you maintain that peace even when life gets difficult, his confidence in his own masculinity skyrockets. He feels like a successful leader because the emotional climate of his relationship is thriving. The transition from the weather to the thermostat is the first and most vital step in inspiring male provision. It sets the baseline for all future interactions. By choosing to be a sanctuary rather than a storm, you align yourself with both ancient biblical wisdom and modern psychological truth. You prove that you are not just looking for a man to extract resources from, but that you are entirely capable of offering the profound emotional safety that makes a man want to give you the world. The second critical method requires confronting what is arguably the most fiercely contested and culturally maligned concept in the modern female lexicon: psychological submission. In contemporary society, this word has been heavily distorted, falsely equated with subjugation, intellectual inferiority, and the tragic loss of a woman's voice. You have been conditioned to believe that yielding any amount of control to a man is a dangerous gamble that will inevitably lead to your exploitation. However, true psychological submission is actually a profound display of relational strength and strategic wisdom. It is the conscious, voluntary surrender of control designed specifically to empower and activate male leadership. To properly understand this dynamic, we must utilize the defining metaphor of the co-pilot. Imagine the flight deck of a commercial airliner navigating through a turbulent storm. The absolute worst-case scenario for the survival of everyone on board is having two captains fighting over the same steering yoke. If both individuals are desperately trying to assert their own flight path, issuing conflicting commands, and wrestling for physical control of the aircraft, a catastrophic crash is entirely inevitable. A successful flight requires a definitive hierarchy of authority, not because one pilot is inherently more valuable as a human being, but because the mechanics of leadership demand a singular point of ultimate responsibility. In this aviation framework, the co-pilot is not a subservient flight attendant fetching coffee, nor is she a passive observer lacking intelligence. She is a highly trained, exceptionally capable, and absolutely vital navigator. She manages complex communications, reads the advanced radar systems, and warns the captain of approaching turbulence from her vantage point in the passenger seat. However, when the critical moment of decision arrives, she deliberately removes her hands from the controls. She yields the active execution of the flight plan to the captain, trusting his training and allowing him to bear the heavy burden of safely landing the plane. This conscious yielding is the exact mechanism that unlocks a man's innate desire to protect and provide. When a woman assumes the role of the co-pilot, she communicates a level of respect that profoundly alters a man's psychological posture. He recognizes that she is highly capable of flying the plane herself, yet she is choosing to trust his navigation. This dynamic shifts the relationship from a competitive power struggle into a collaborative alliance. By relinquishing the need to dictate every outcome, the feminine woman forces the masculine man to step up, grip the controls, and take full responsibility for their shared destination. We find the ultimate biblical blueprint for this specific dynamic in the historical narrative of Sarah and Abraham. Sarah was not a weak, voiceless woman. She was a matriarch of immense wealth, profound beauty, and significant social standing in the ancient city of Ur. When Abraham received a radical vision to uproot their entire existence and travel toward an unseen, unknown land, Sarah was faced with a monumental choice regarding her own autonomy. She could have demanded a strategic 10-year plan, formed a committee to debate the logistics, or outright refused to leave the safety of her established civilization. Instead, Sarah made the extraordinary decision to step fully into the role of the co-pilot. She consciously chose to honor Abraham's ultimate authority over their family's direction, trusting his leadership even when the path forward was terrifying and completely devoid of guarantees. The biblical text later highlights Sarah's profound respect, noting that she referred to Abraham as Lord. In the modern context, this title is often misunderstood as a marker of slavery, but in antiquity, it was the ultimate signifier of deep, unwavering respect for a husband's headship. Sarah was not diminishing her own worth. She was actively validating his role as the supreme protector of their household. This immense display of trust had a direct, transformative impact on Abraham's sense of duty. Because Sarah willingly abandoned her own geographical and financial security to follow his lead, Abraham's psychological imperative to protect her became the defining mission of his life. He understood that she had placed her very survival entirely in his hands. A masculine man does not take that level of absolute trust lightly. It forges an unbreakable bond of loyalty and a fierce, relentless drive to ensure his woman is sheltered, fed, and cherished. Sarah's conscious surrender of control was the exact catalyst that activated Abraham's legendary provision. To understand why Sarah's ancient strategy remains flawlessly effective today, we must examine the modern psychology of male ego integration and the concept known as the trust metric. In modern psychological terms, a man's ego is not a negative manifestation of arrogance. It is the vital, structural foundation of his identity and his drive to interact with the world. A masculine man's self-worth is inextricably linked to his perceived competence. He possesses a deep, biological need to know that he is capable of solving complex problems, navigating external threats, and successfully leading his family to a place of safety. The trust metric is the internal gauge a man uses to measure how much his partner believes in his competence. When a man makes a decision and his woman visibly trusts his judgment without second-guessing him, his brain experiences a massive neurochemical reward. This validation triggers a surge of dopamine, the neurotransmitter responsible for motivation, focus, and goal-directed behavior. When he successfully executes his plan and sees that his leadership has benefited his partner, his body produces a subsequent surge of testosterone. This creates a powerful, biological positive feedback loop that reinforces his desire to lead. Conversely, when a woman constantly questions a man's judgment, she is systematically attacking his trust metric. Every time she overrides his decisions, she is signaling to his nervous system that he is incompetent. This brings us to the modern case study of a woman we will call Jessica. Jessica is a highly successful, fiercely intelligent project manager who inadvertently brought her corporate boss girl dynamics directly into her romantic relationship. She treated her partnership not as a sanctuary, but as another logistical project to be aggressively optimized and perfectly managed. Jessica was entirely incapable of sitting in the co-pilot's seat. If her boyfriend was driving, she was constantly correcting his route, warning him about traffic, and suggesting shortcuts. If he loaded the dishwasher, she would follow behind him, rearranging the plates to maximize efficiency. If he planned a date night, she would interrogate him about the restaurant's reviews, the parking situation, and the reservation timing. Jessica genuinely believed she was just being helpful, utilizing her natural talents to ensure their lives ran smoothly and without error. What Jessica failed to realize was that her chronic micromanagement was actively destroying her partner's biological feedback loops. Every time she corrected his driving or redid his chores, she was delivering a neurochemical strike against his ego integration. She was communicating, through 1,000 tiny actions, that she simply did not trust him to handle the basic logistics of their life. Because his competence was constantly under siege, his brain stopped releasing the dopamine associated with problem-solving. His testosterone levels plummeted because he was never allowed to conquer his environment or finalize a task without her supervision. The psychological fallout of Jessica's behavior was severe. Her partner eventually adopted a state of learned helplessness. He realized that no matter what he did, Jessica was going to intervene, critique, and ultimately take over the controls. To protect his own peace and avoid the constant feelings of inadequacy, he simply stopped trying. He stopped planning dates, stopped offering solutions to household problems, and retreated into extreme passivity. He effectively unbuckled himself from the captain's seat and moved to the back of the plane, leaving Jessica to fly the aircraft entirely alone. Jessica soon found herself deeply resentful and physically exhausted. She complained bitterly to her friends that she had to do everything herself, lamenting that her partner lacked initiative and masculine drive. She desperately wanted him to take charge, to relieve her of the mental load, and to provide the protective leadership she craved. Yet, she was entirely blind to the fact that she had actively engineered his passivity. You cannot simultaneously demand that a man drive the car, while you are constantly wrestling him for the steering wheel and criticizing his use of the brakes. To repair this dynamic and unlock a man's capacity to provide, a woman must learn the profound discipline of biting her tongue. She must consciously choose to prioritize her partner's ego integration over her own desire for absolute efficiency. This means allowing him to lead, even if he takes the longer route to the restaurant. It means letting him fix the leaky sink, even if it takes him twice as long as the plumber you wanted to hire. It means entrusting him with financial decisions and actively resisting the urge to audit his every move. When a woman stops backseat driving and visibly places her trust in a man's capabilities, the psychological shift is almost instantaneous. The moment he realizes that his trust metric is secure, that his co-pilot genuinely believes in his ability to navigate, his posture changes. The heavy burden of responsibility, which once felt like an opportunity for failure and criticism, suddenly feels like a noble calling. His dopamine pathways reopen, his testosterone surges, and his innate biological drive to shelter and care for his partner is fully resurrected. This transition requires immense internal restraint from the modern woman. You have been taught that your value lies in your hypercompetence and your ability to flawlessly manage every detail of your existence. Relinquishing that control will initially trigger your anxiety. You will feel a desperate urge to intervene when you see him making a choice you wouldn't make. However, you must recognize that your visible trust is the master key that unlocks his psychological capacity to cherish you. When you constantly correct a man, you're telling him he is a child who needs a mother. Men do not provide for their mothers, they rebel against them or passively rely on them. Men provide for women who respect them. By deliberately stepping back and allowing him to experience the consequences and triumphs of his own leadership, you are offering him the ultimate respect. You are telling him that you view him as a competent, powerful captain, fully capable of charting the course for your shared life. Consider the profound relief that comes with embracing the co-pilot role. You no longer have to carry the crushing weight of having every answer, predicting every outcome, and managing every crisis. You are allowed to rest in the passenger seat. You can still offer your brilliant insights, your gentle guidance, and your vital navigation, but you are finally free from the exhausting burden of ultimate execution. This is the true luxury of a relationship defined by traditional provision. A man who feels deeply trusted will move mountains to ensure his partner's comfort. He will view her trust not as an invitation to be lazy, but as a sacred mandate to perform at his absolute best. He knows that she has handed him the controls of her heart, her safety, and her future. That realization integrates his ego in the healthiest, most masculine way possible. He becomes a provider not out of obligation, but out of a profound, biological pride in his ability to successfully pilot the life of the woman who believes in him. Embracing psychological submission is not a surrender of your dignity. It is the ultimate elevation of your relational influence. By mastering the trust metric and consciously empowering his leadership, you create a dynamic where his success is directly tied to your well-being. You prove that you are not competing with him for dominance, but rather allying with him for mutual flourishing. When you finally let go of the yoke, you give him the space he desperately needs to become the protector you have always desired. The third method fundamentally deconstructs the mechanics of inspiring male provision through the deliberate application of strategic, authentic vulnerability. Modern culture has trained women to view vulnerability as a fatal flaw, a dangerous opening that invites exploitation and weakness. You are taught to project absolute self-sufficiency, ensuring that no man ever thinks you actually require his assistance to survive. Yet, this relentless projection of invulnerability is exactly what starves a relationship of its provider dynamic. To activate a man's desire to care for you, you must understand the powerful metaphor of the empty vessel. In the realm of physics, it is a universal law that nature abhors a vacuum. Whenever a void is created, the surrounding elements immediately rush in to fill the empty space, equalizing the pressure and restoring balance. This same principle governs the energetic exchange between masculine and feminine polarities. Masculine energy is inherently active, penetrating, and profoundly driven to provide solutions, resources, and protection. However, it can only flow into a space that is actually empty and waiting to receive it. If you approach a relationship as a vessel that is already brimming to the top with your own capability, your own money, and your own problem-solving skills, there is absolutely no room for a man to pour into you. You are completely full. When a masculine man encounters a woman who aggressively handles every single crisis and manages every logistical detail of her life, his provider instincts remain entirely dormant. He looks at her overflowing vessel and subconsciously concludes that his resources are simply not required here. To invite his provision, you must possess the grace and the courage to empty the vessel. You must be willing to create a localized vacuum by gracefully admitting your need for help, effectively pulling his masculine energy toward you. We witness the absolute pinnacle of this strategic vulnerability in the biblical account of Abigail. Abigail was married to a harsh, foolish man named Nabal, who deeply insulted the future king, David, by refusing him hospitality. Enraged by this profound disrespect, David strapped on his sword and marched toward Abigail's estate with 400 armed men, fully intending to annihilate her entire household. The impending slaughter was a crisis of catastrophic proportions, driven by unchecked masculine aggression. When Abigail heard of the approaching army, she did not arm herself, nor did she attempt to construct a fortress to fight David off. She did not ride out to meet him with a list of demands or an arrogant display of her own independent wealth. Instead, she gathered a massive offering of provisions and rode out to intercept the furious warrior with a masterclass in de-escalation. The moment she saw David, she immediately dismounted her donkey, fell on her face, and bowed to the ground before him. She presented him with the ultimate empty vessel. Abigail took the entirety of the blame upon herself, an act of profound, authentic vulnerability that instantly halted David's march. She spoke to him with immense reverence, appealing directly to his honor, his future legacy, and his identity as a protector rather than a shedder of innocent blood. She did not lecture him or attempt to match his aggressive energy. By lowering herself and submitting a humble, vulnerable petition, she created a massive psychological vacuum. She essentially told him that she was entirely at his mercy, relying strictly on his righteous judgment and his masculine grace to spare her life. Confronted with a woman who had completely dropped her defenses and placed her life in his hands, David's aggressive fury instantly evaporated. Her strategic vulnerability completely short-circuited his wrath and redirected his intense masculine energy into a posture of protective devotion. He blessed her, accepted her offerings, and turned his army around, entirely disarmed by her profound feminine wisdom. Later, after Nabal's sudden death, David was so captivated by the memory of Abigail's graceful vulnerability that he immediately sent for her, elevating her to the status of his protected, cherished wife. Abigail's ancient narrative perfectly illustrates a deeply ingrained evolutionary mechanism known in modern psychology as the hero instinct. Coined by relationship experts, the hero instinct postulates that men are biologically and psychologically hardwired to seek out relationships where they feel fundamentally indispensable. A man does not fall in love with a woman simply because she is beautiful, wealthy, or highly educated. He bonds with a woman who makes him feel like a hero, a woman who provides him with a tangible, ongoing role as her ultimate problem solver and protector. This instinct is not a superficial desire for ego stroking. It is an evolutionary imperative deeply tied to his testosterone production and his psychological self-worth. Throughout human history, a man's value to his tribe was strictly measured by his ability to hunt, defend, and shelter the vulnerable. While modern society has largely removed the threat of saber-toothed tigers and invading tribes, male biology has not changed. A man still desperately needs a mission. He needs a dragon to slay, a heavy burden to lift, and a damsel who authentically requires his specific brand of strength. To see this psychological framework in action, we must examine the clinical case study of a modern woman we will call Mia. Mia was a fiercely independent urban professional who prided herself on being entirely self-made. If her car had a flat tire, she watched a tutorial and changed it herself in the rain. If she needed a new piece of heavy furniture, she wrestled it up 3 flights of stairs alone, refusing to ask her boyfriend for help. She meticulously split every dinner bill down the middle and fiercely guarded her financial autonomy. Mia believed that by demanding absolutely nothing from her partner, she was being the perfect, low-maintenance girlfriend. She thought her extreme self-reliance would make him love her more, proving she wasn't a burden to his life. Instead, her relationship was rapidly deteriorating into a passionless, platonic roommate dynamic. Her boyfriend was lethargic, unromantic, and seemed entirely disinvested in their shared future. Because Mia never presented him with an empty vessel, his hero instinct was completely starved of oxygen. He felt useless in her life, a mere accessory to her perfectly managed, hyper-independent existence. The turning point occurred when Mia learned about the mechanics of evolutionary psychology and realized that her refusal to need him was actively destroying his attraction to her. She decided to conduct a radical experiment in strategic vulnerability. She had to learn how to consciously step back, drop the heavy lifting, and allow him to step into the void. The first opportunity arose when Mia's laptop unexpectedly crashed right before a major presentation. Normally, she would have panicked, rushed to a tech repair shop, and spent her own money to fix it instantly, never mentioning the stress to her partner. Instead, she called him. She didn't demand he fix it, nor did she play the role of a helpless victim. She simply presented the empty vessel. She told him she was incredibly stressed, that she didn't know what to do, and asked if he could possibly help her figure it out. The shift in his demeanor was instantaneous. The lethargic, disengaged boyfriend vanished, replaced by a highly focused, energized problem solver. He immediately drove over, took apart the computer, diagnosed the issue, and spent 3 hours recovering her data. When he handed the working laptop back to her, his chest was puffed out, and his eyes were bright with a profound sense of accomplishment. By simply asking for his help, Mia had flooded his brain with a massive dose of dopamine and protective testosterone. Recognizing the incredible power of this biological trigger, Mia began to systematically apply the empty vessel strategy to other areas of their life. She stopped carrying the heavy groceries up the stairs, leaving them in the trunk, and asking him to fetch them. She stopped managing all the travel logistics for their vacations, deliberately handing him the itinerary and trusting him to navigate the airports and hotel bookings. Most importantly, she stopped aggressively splitting the bills. When the check arrived at dinner, instead of immediately lunging for her purse to prove her financial independence, she simply paused. She created a vacuum. She allowed the silence to hang in the air, offering him the opportunity to step up. And he did, because he was already feeling highly valued and essential in the physical and logistical aspects of her life. Stepping into the role of financial provider felt like the natural, masculine progression. He eagerly paid the bill, deeply satisfied by his ability to treat her. Over the course of 6 months, the entire architecture of their relationship transformed. Mia's partner began to actively look for ways to make her life easier. He took over the maintenance of her car, managed the household repairs, and eventually insisted on covering the majority of their shared living expenses. His self-worth had become inextricably linked to his ability to successfully shelter and care for her. He felt like a king because she finally allowed him to carry the weight of the crown. Modern women fiercely resist this concept because they conflate needing help with being incompetent. You have been told that if you ask a man to change a tire or pay a bill, you are betraying your own empowerment. You are terrified that if you allow a man to provide for you, he will somehow use it as leverage to trap or control you. This fear keeps you locked in a state of perpetual exhaustion, aggressively fighting off the very provision you desperately crave in the quiet moments of your life. It is crucial to distinguish between strategic, authentic vulnerability and toxic, manipulative helplessness. The empty vessel is not about playing dumb or pretending you cannot function as a basic adult. It is about making a conscious, high-value choice to delegate the masculine burdens of life to a man who is biologically wired to carry them. It is recognizing that while you are entirely capable of doing everything yourself, you absolutely do not have to. You are choosing to reserve your feminine energy for higher purposes by allowing him to conquer the physical and logistical challenges. When you gracefully admit your need for a man's strength, you are giving him a profound psychological gift. You are offering him the stage upon which he can perform his masculinity. Every time he fixes a leaky faucet, opens a tight jar, or pays for a meal, he is subconsciously tallying a victory. These micro-victories accumulate, building a massive reservoir of protective devotion toward you. He looks at you and sees the woman who made him feel like the most capable, powerful man in the world. Creating this dynamic requires immense courage and internal discipline. It is far easier to build a wall of self-reliance than it is to stand before a man with an empty vessel and trust him to fill it. You have to mourn the false safety of your hyperindependence. You must look at the exhausting, heavy load you have been carrying for years and willingly set it down at his feet. You must endure the temporary discomfort of not being in absolute control of every single variable in your environment. Think back to Abigail bowing in the dirt before David. She was a wealthy, intelligent woman, yet she understood that her survival depended entirely on her willingness to lower herself and appeal to his masculine grace. In the modern dating market, bowing does not mean literal physical prostration. It means lowering your ego. It means swallowing your pride and saying the three most powerful words a provider-oriented man can ever hear. I need you. Those three words are the ultimate activation codes for the hero instinct. They cut through the noise of modern equality metrics and speak directly to a man's ancient, evolutionary soul. When you tell a man that you need his specific strength, his specific intellect, or his specific provision, you are permanently separating yourself from the millions of women who are aggressively screaming that they need no one. You become an oasis of purpose in a desert of hyper-independent isolation. A man's self-worth is a fragile, highly reactive construct that requires continuous validation through action. If you constantly prove that you are his equal in every masculine endeavor, if you outturn him, outlift him, and outhustle him, he will respect you as a colleague, but he will never cherish you as a wife. He cannot feel protective over a woman who operates like a rival gladiator in the arena of life. To inspire his provision, you must deliberately create an asymmetry of capability in the areas where his masculinity is designed to shine. This means strategically retreating from the masculine domains of relentless problem-solving and financial burden-bearing. You must allow him to be the hero of the story. If you are constantly swooping in to save yourself, you are stealing his lines and ruining his narrative. A true hero requires a genuine crisis, however small, to prove his worth and solidify his identity. By leaving the vessel empty, you are simply setting the stage for him to succeed. The beauty of the empty vessel strategy is that it creates a self-sustaining cycle of mutual fulfillment. The more you authentically rely on him, the more he provides. The more he provides, the more his masculine confidence grows. As his confidence grows, he becomes even more capable and generous, eager to shoulder even larger burdens to ensure your continued comfort and safety. Your vulnerability becomes the high-octane fuel that powers his lifelong provision. You must stop viewing your need for a man as a liability and start weaponizing it as your greatest relational asset. By mastering the art of strategic vulnerability and deliberately triggering the hero instinct, you completely rewrite the rules of engagement. You transition from an exhausted competitor into a cherished priority, gracefully allowing a masculine protector to step into the void and build a permanent fortress of provision around your life. The fourth method shifts the relational dynamic outward, focusing intensely on the physical and energetic space you cultivate around your provider. If your vulnerability initially invites his masculine energy in, your environment is what permanently anchors him there. This requires mastering the sophisticated art of environmental nurturing and establishing a strict domestic sanctuary. We must conceptualize this transformative power through the ancient, evocative metaphor of the hearth. The hearth is the warm, life-sustaining center of human existence, the literal and figurative fire that naturally draws a man back from the cold. The modern external world is an unforgiving, hyper-competitive wasteland for a masculine provider. He spends his entire day navigating corporate battlefields, managing external threats, and operating in a state of high alert vigilance. His nervous system is constantly bombarded by the harsh demands of the marketplace, forcing him to maintain a rigid, defensive posture just to survive. When he finally unbuckles his armor and steps through his front door, he is subconsciously seeking an immediate cessation of hostilities. If he crosses the threshold only to be met with visual chaos, frantic energy, and a cold atmosphere, his defensive posture remains entirely locked in place. A man cannot be a generous, relaxed provider if his home is simply a continuation of the battlefield. The hearth represents the deliberate curation of a refuge that stands in stark contrast to the outside world. It is an environment so deeply saturated in feminine warmth that it acts as a gravitational pull, inevitably drawing his mind and body back to you. When a woman acts as the keeper of the hearth, she transforms her physical dwelling into a psychological fortress of peace. She creates an oasis that actively restores the energy he depleted while securing their survival. To understand the profound biological impact of this curation, we must explore the scientific pillar of environmental psychology combined with somatic soothing. Environmental psychology studies how physical spaces directly manipulate human cognition, emotion, and physiological stress responses. Every single sensory input in a home, the lighting, the organization, the textures, and the scents, sends an immediate, subconscious signal to the brain's amygdala. If a space is cluttered, brightly lit with harsh artificial bulbs, and devoid of softness, the brain interprets it as a chaotic, high-stress environment. This prevents the drop in cortisol necessary for true physical recovery. Somatic soothing is the intentional practice of using environmental cues to bypass the conscious mind and directly calm the physical body. A feminine woman uses her home as a somatic instrument to physically downregulate her partner's nervous system the moment he arrives. She understands that a man's biological drive to provide is deeply tied to his physical comfort and his ability to recharge. By controlling the sensory landscape, she dictates his physiological state. This is not about superficial interior decorating. It is highly strategic biological management. We see the dramatic efficacy of this approach in the clinical case study of a woman we will call Olivia. Olivia was married to a highly successful, driven man who carried the massive burden of being the sole financial provider for their lifestyle. However, Olivia viewed her home merely as a functional crash pad, showing zero interest in domestic curation. Her house was a chaotic landscape of unopened mail, unorganized spaces, harsh overhead lighting, and the constant, frantic background noise of television and modern media. She treated domesticity as an outdated chore beneath her intellect, completely unaware of the psychological toll it was taking on her marriage. Olivia's husband was chronically agitated, emotionally withdrawn, and increasingly finding reasons to stay late at the office or travel for work. The office, despite its high-pressure stakes, was orderly, predictable, and visually organized, whereas his home was an aesthetic and emotional assault on his senses. Because his cortisol levels never dropped when he walked through the front door, he began to subconsciously resent the financial pressure of maintaining a home that offered him no peace. He was paying a premium for a sanctuary, but receiving a chaotic storage unit. The lack of somatic soothing was actively eroding his motivation to provide. Realizing her marriage was fracturing, Olivia completely overhauled her approach by diving deep into environmental psychology. She began to view her role not as a passive occupant, but as the active domestic architect of their shared domain. Olivia systematically eliminated the visual clutter that was spiking her husband's anxiety, creating clean, open spaces that allowed his eyes to rest. She banished the harsh overhead lights, replacing them with warm, amber-toned ambient lamps that mimicked the ancestral glow of a fire. She introduced heavy, soft textiles and plush furnishings that physically invited his body to sink in and release tension. Crucially, Olivia mastered the olfactory component of somatic soothing. The human olfactory bulb has a direct neural link to the limbic system, the brain's emotional and memory center. Olivia began to consistently diffuse grounding, masculine-leaning scents like cedarwood, sandalwood, and warm vanilla throughout the house just before he arrived. The transformation in her husband was biological and immediate. The first time he walked into this newly curated hearth, his shoulders visibly dropped, his breathing slowed, and the rigid tension in his jaw completely dissolved. This physical reaction brings us to the powerful psychological mechanism of classical conditioning. First identified by Ivan Pavlov, classical conditioning is a learning process where a biologically potent stimulus is paired with a previously neutral stimulus. In Olivia's case, the biologically potent stimulus was the profound somatic relief and dopamine release triggered by the curated environment. The neutral stimulus was the act of him coming home and financing their lifestyle. By consistently ensuring his arrival was met with aesthetic beauty, calming sense, and emotional peace, Olivia completely rewired his brain. Through repeated exposure, his nervous system formed a permanent, unbreakable association between his financial provision and the physical reward of total domestic bliss. He no longer viewed paying the mortgage or working grueling hours as a thankless burden. Instead, his brain registered his labor as the necessary currency to access his ultimate physical and emotional sanctuary. He began to rush home from work, eager to cross the threshold and experience the somatic downregulation Olivia had so perfectly engineered. His generosity skyrocketed because he was deeply addicted to the peace his money was funding. When a man is classically conditioned to associate your curated environment with his own physiological relief, he becomes fiercely protective of that dynamic. He will joyfully deploy his resources to maintain, upgrade, and secure the hearth because it directly benefits his own survival and sanity. He views the woman who orchestrates this peace not as a financial dependent, but as an absolute necessity for his mental health. You become the indispensable architect of his recovery. This is how you lock in a provider's devotion without ever having to demand it. This profound mastery of the domestic sphere brings us to an exclusive, critical reframing of the ultimate biblical archetype, the Proverbs 31 woman. For decades, modern feminist theology and hustle culture have aggressively hijacked this specific scripture. You have been sold a massive distortion, told that the Proverbs 31 woman is an ancient template for the modern, hyper-independent corporate girl boss. Commentators point to her buying fields and trading goods as proof that she was a self-reliant entrepreneur who didn't need a man. This interpretation completely destroys the actual context and purpose of her immense capability. The Proverbs 31 woman is not an independent corporate hustler building an autonomous empire separate from her husband. She is the ultimate, fully invested domestic architect. Every single ounce of her formidable intelligence, her economic savvy, and her creative energy is channeled strictly into enhancing her husband's domain and fortifying their household. She is not competing with him in the marketplace for status. She is utilizing her talents to optimize the sanctuary. Her focus is entirely tethered to the hearth, ensuring that her family is clothed in scarlet and deeply insulated from the harshness of winter. The biblical text explicitly states that because of her flawless domestic architecture, her husband lacks nothing of value. He has absolute, unwavering confidence in her because she uses her power to secure his home front, not to outshine him. She curates such an immaculate, well-functioning, and beautiful environment that it directly elevates his status in the external world. The scripture notes that her husband is respected at the city gates, where he takes his seat among the elders of the land. He can achieve the pinnacle of masculine success strictly because his mind is completely free from domestic anxiety. When a man's home is in chaos, a massive portion of his mental bandwidth is drained trying to manage the dysfunction. He cannot conquer the city gates if he is constantly worried about the crumbling state of his own fortress. The Proverbs 31 woman eliminates this mental drain entirely. She takes ownership of the environmental nurturing, curating a space so rich in beauty, order, and warmth that her husband is fully released to focus on his singular mission of providing and protecting. She is the quiet engine of his public success. Modern women deeply resist this calling because society has convinced them that domestic curation is a form of oppression. You have been trained to view managing a home, creating aesthetic beauty, and facilitating peace as menial tasks devoid of real value. You would rather pour your best energy into a sterile corporate cubicle for a boss who views you as replaceable than pour it into a hearth for a man who would view you as a queen. This tragic misallocation of feminine energy is exactly why so many women are starved of the provider dynamic they secretly crave. A masculine man does not want to finance a roommate who contributes nothing to the energetic quality of his life. He wants to finance a masterpiece. When you embrace the role of the domestic architect, you transform his house into a living, breathing work of art that sustains his soul. You prove that his hard-earned resources are being utilized to cultivate a beautiful life, rather than being squandered in a chaotic, mismanaged environment. Your ability to create a haven is the highest return on investment a provider can ever experience. Stepping into this archetype requires a radical shift in how you view your own environment. You must begin to look at your home through the lens of somatic soothing and environmental psychology. Ask yourself if the space you currently inhabit invites a man to drop his armor, or if it demands that he keep it on. Look at the lighting, smell the air, and assess the visual landscape. If your environment is frantic, cold, and disorganized, you are actively repelling the protective, providing energy you wish to attract. Creating the hearth is a profound act of feminine power. It is the deliberate, intelligent application of sensory input to capture a man's heart and soothe his nervous system. When you combine the biological leverage of classical conditioning with the ancient wisdom of the Proverbs, 31 domestic architect, you become entirely irreplaceable. You transition from being just another demanding presence in his life to being the absolute center of his gravity. He will gladly face the brutal, freezing winds of the external world because he knows exactly what awaits him at the end of the day. He knows that his provision secures a sanctuary of unparalleled warmth, beauty, and peace. By mastering the art of environmental nurturing, you ensure that no matter how far he travels or how hard he battles, his deepest, most primal biological urge will always be to return to the hearth you have built. The fifth and final method explores the absolute pinnacle of relational mastery, focusing on sustaining your long-term value and forging an unbreakable spiritual alliance through the profound power of peaceful presence. To understand the ultimate goal of the provider dynamic, we must embrace the defining metaphor of the crown. In antiquity, a crown was not merely a piece of decorative jewelry. It was the ultimate, visible manifestation of a king's successful conquest, his immense wealth, and his sovereign stability. A king did not forge his own crown to admire in isolation. He placed it upon his head or upon his queen to communicate his uncontested power and peace to the rest of the world. In the modern relational landscape, a woman's tranquil, deeply supportive energy serves as the exact equivalent of this crowning glory. A masculine man's greatest status symbol is not his sports car, his corporate title, or the size of his investment portfolio. His ultimate status symbol is the radiant, relaxed disposition of the woman standing beside him. When a man navigates the brutal, hyper-competitive external world and achieves financial success, his deepest biological desire is to see that success reflected in the physical and emotional rest of his partner. If he conquers the marketplace, but his woman remains perpetually stressed, frantic, and overworked, he subconsciously registers his provision as a massive failure. A woman who embodies the crown does not compete with her provider for dominance, nor does she exhaust herself trying to match his masculine output. She understands that her highest contribution to his life is her unwavering peace. By allowing herself to be fully taken care of, she becomes the living, breathing testament to his capability. When other men look at a woman who is thoroughly relaxed, flourishing, and entirely unburdened by the harsh realities of survival, they immediately recognize the formidable strength of the man standing behind her. She is his crown, the ultimate proof that he is a highly effective, successful protector. We find the absolute mastery of this concept in the biblical archetype of Mary of Bethany. The narrative of Mary and her sister Martha serves as the ultimate mirror for the modern woman's internal struggle. When Jesus entered their home, Martha immediately shifted into a state of frantic, task-oriented hyperproductivity. She was entirely consumed by the logistics of hosting, sprinting around the house, preparing the meal, and managing the physical environment. Martha believed that her immense labor and her visible exhaustion were the primary currencies that would earn her validation and prove her worth to her guest. Mary, however, chose an entirely different posture. She completely abandoned the frantic hustle of domestic management and simply sat at the feet of Jesus, offering him her deep, attentive presence. She prioritized spiritual connection and tranquil receptivity over the anxious need to constantly be doing. Martha, deeply resentful of her sister's stillness, demanded that Jesus intervene and force Mary to help with the exhausting labor. Instead of validating Martha's intense productivity, Jesus delivered a profound correction, stating that Martha was anxious and troubled about many things, but Mary had chosen the better part, which would not be taken from her. Modern women are entirely trapped in the archetype of Martha. You have been conditioned to believe that your worth in a relationship is strictly tied to your relentless output, your financial contributions, and your ability to aggressively manage every detail of your shared existence. You are running yourself ragged, trying to prove to a man that you are a valuable asset through sheer, exhausting effort. You sigh heavily, you complain about the endless tasks, and you harbor a deep, simmering resentment toward the man you are trying to impress. You are offering him your stress, entirely unaware that what he desperately craves is your stillness. A masculine provider does not want to come home to a second project manager who is drowning in task-oriented anxiety. He wants to come home to Mary. He wants a woman who has the spiritual maturity and the feminine confidence to stop doing and simply start being. Choosing the better part means recognizing that your peaceful presence is infinitely more valuable to a man's soul than your frantic productivity. It means sitting with him, offering him your undivided attention, and creating a space of deep spiritual and emotional connection that cannot be found anywhere else in his chaotic world. When you embody the energy of Mary, you cease trying to earn your keep through masculine hustle. You realize that a man who is wired to provide wants to relieve you of the heavy lifting, not watch you collapse under the weight of it. Your stillness is not laziness. It is the ultimate display of trust in his provision. By deliberately stepping out of the frantic cycle of doing, you offer him the rare, intoxicating gift of a woman who is entirely at rest. This deep, spiritual alliance forms an unbreakable bond, elevating the relationship from a mere logistical partnership to a profound soul connection. To sustain this dynamic permanently, we must transition from ancient biblical wisdom to the modern psychological framework of operant conditioning. Developed by the legendary behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner, operant conditioning dictates that human behavior is fundamentally shaped by its immediate consequences. Specifically, behaviors that are followed by positive reinforcement are highly likely to be repeated, while behaviors that are ignored or punished will rapidly face extinction. In the context of a traditional relationship, a man's drive to provide, protect, and cherish is an operant behavior that must be systematically reinforced to survive. Positive reinforcement is the introduction of a highly desirable stimulus immediately following a specific behavior. For a masculine man, the most powerful psychological reward on earth is the genuine, high-value appreciation and verbal affirmation of the woman he loves. When a man pays a bill, fixes a problem, or makes a decision that benefits your life, he is subconsciously waiting for the behavioral consequence. If his provision is met with silence, entitlement, or worse, a critique of how he could have done it better, his brain registers a negative consequence. Over time, his innate drive to provide will completely extinguish. This brings us to the clinical case study of a woman we will call Chloe. Chloe was deeply entrenched in the modern feminist narrative that aggressively warned women against praising men for the bare minimum. She desperately wanted a man to take the lead and finance her life, but when her partner actually stepped up to provide, she offered absolutely zero positive reinforcement. If he paid for an expensive dinner, she simply expected it as her due. If he spent his weekend repairing her car, she complained that it took him too long. Chloe believed that withholding her praise gave her the upper hand and maintained her independence. Because Chloe's partner received no positive reinforcement for his efforts, his nervous system began to associate providing for her with feelings of inadequacy and resentment. His operant behavior was facing rapid extinction. He stopped planning lavish dates, he stopped offering financial assistance, and he emotionally withdrew. Chloe was furious, interpreting his retreat as proof that modern men were simply lazy and incapable of traditional provision. She was entirely blind to the fact that she had actively starved his provider instincts, to death through her chronic lack of appreciation. The turning point occurred when Chloe was introduced to the mechanics of operant conditioning and realized that her entitlement was destroying her own desired outcome. She had to undergo a massive ego death. She had to unlearn the toxic modern advice that told her verbal affirmation was a sign of weakness. Chloe decided to implement a strict, intentional strategy of positive reinforcement, transforming herself into a consistent source of high-value appreciation. She began to actively hunt for opportunities to praise her partner's masculine efforts, no matter how small. The first time he took her car to get the oil changed, instead of giving a brief, dismissive nod, Chloe offered targeted verbal affirmation. She looked him directly in the eyes, softened her voice, and said, "Thank you so much for handling this for me. I feel so incredibly safe and taken care of when you manage these things." The psychological impact on her partner was explosive. Her words delivered a massive, concentrated dose of dopamine directly to his brain's reward center. His posture straightened, his chest expanded, and he felt a profound surge of masculine pride. Chloe had successfully established a sustainable reward loop. Because her partner experienced such an intense neurological reward from her praise, his brain immediately began seeking new ways to trigger that exact same response. He started anticipating her needs, taking over the household finances, and actively looking for burdens he could lift from her shoulders. Every single time he stepped into the provider role, Chloe was there with the positive reinforcement. She became his most reliable source of ego integration and emotional validation. This is the hidden secret to sustaining a lifelong dynamic of reciprocal care. A man will never tire of providing for a woman who never tires of appreciating him. Your verbal affirmation is the high-octane fuel that keeps the engine of his provision running indefinitely. When you master the art of positive reinforcement, you are not manipulating him. You are aligning with his deepest biological imperatives. You are giving him exactly what he needs to feel like a successful, powerful man, and in return, he gives you the sheltered, provided-for life you deeply desire. Modern culture mocks this dynamic, labeling it as subservient or archaic. You are told that a strong woman shouldn't have to stroke a man's ego to get her needs met. This toxic ideology is exactly why so many modern relationships are characterized by bitter power struggles and profound exhaustion. Refusing to offer positive reinforcement is like refusing to water a garden because you believe the seeds should just grow on their own. If you want to reap the harvest of a man's lifelong provision, you must be willing to consistently water his efforts with your profound, authentic appreciation. Chloe's transformation from an entitled, demanding critic into a warm, appreciative crown completely saved her relationship. Her partner eventually proposed, not because she had hustled to prove her financial worth, but because she had made his life emotionally rich. He wanted to permanently secure his access to the woman who made him feel like a king. Chloe secured her lifelong position as a cherished, protected priority strictly through the power of positive reinforcement and peaceful presence. She stopped fighting for control and started rewarding his leadership. Embodying the crown requires a daily, conscious commitment to remaining in your feminine energy. It is not a temporary dating strategy that you can abandon the moment a ring is placed on your finger. It is a lifelong spiritual and psychological alliance. You must continuously choose the better part, resisting the urge to slip back into the frantic, hyper-independent hustle of Martha. You must fiercely guard your own peace, recognizing that your tranquility is the ultimate gift you offer to your protector. When a man knows that his provision secures your peace, and your peace in turn validates his masculinity, the relationship becomes an unbreakable fortress. You create an ecosystem of mutual devotion that the modern world cannot penetrate. He shields you from the harshness of the external grind, and you shield him from the emotional coldness of a society that constantly tears men down. You become his sanctuary, his reward, and his ultimate crowning achievement. This requires you to fully drop the armor you have worn for so long. You must mourn the illusion of safety that your fierce independence gave you, and embrace the beautiful, terrifying vulnerability of relying on a masculine protector. You must trust that, when you step fully into the radiant, appreciative, and peaceful energy of the crown, a provider-oriented man will naturally rise to the occasion. He will move heaven and earth to ensure that his crown never loses its luster. The journey from an exhausted, hyper-independent woman to a cherished, provided-for partner is entirely within your grasp. It requires dismantling the lies of modern culture, embracing ancient biblical archetypes, and mastering the psychological triggers that govern male devotion. By prioritizing your spiritual presence over frantic doing, and by creating a lifelong reward loop of genuine appreciation, you secure a dynamic of profound reciprocal care. You no longer have to fight the world alone. You can finally rest, knowing you are deeply loved, fiercely protected, and eternally cherished. Thank you so much for watching. If you found value in this series and are ready to transform your relationship, please subscribe to the channel for more content.